Guys, thanks so much for joining me today. Today, the purpose of our conversation is to be kind of an extension of our series, Live Your Anthem. So we're going to be talking about how to discern your calling. And we really want to make this conversation more accessible because sometimes calling can feel kind of abstract or far-fetched. So first, I just want to open it up. What would you define calling as? Pastor Brad, can we start with you? How would you define calling?
I think calling, when you just begin with, has to start from the heart of God, right? And the idea is that someone's calling out to someone else. So when I think of calling, I think so much around what is God's heart for me and what's the impact of that. And then I think sometimes that then translates to when God's speaking into my life, into the way I act, the way that I live, my vocation. It speaks to all kinds of areas of my life, who I might marry, where I might live. So there's a lot of different pieces of calling, but I think it has to start from the heart of God first, because He's the one that calls.
That's so good. Guys, y'all have anything to add?
I think I would say, when I look at the book of Ephesians in chapter 2, God saves us by His grace.
Yes.
And then verse 10 says, and He created me to do good works. So when I think about calling, I think from that same perspective that God's created and knitted me together specifically to do something on this earth to reflect His glory. And I think the big idea is, what can I do to reflect God's glory? How has He designed me to do it that way? So that would be what I'd say.
Yeah, I think a little bit along those same lines with 2 Corinthians, where it talks about us, being called, that God reconciled Himself to us, and that we're called to be ministers of reconciliation. So like that, I feel like that's just like you said, like that's what God's called us to. That's the basis. Like it's His calling to us primarily, and then we are called then to move on. So whatever our calling is specifically, which can be as unique as vocational ministry all the way out to something that seems very, very far from anything like vocational ministry, but at the basis and the foundation, God's call is for us to be ministers of reconciliation, and that looks very different in very different vocations and very different places, but that's like the very foundation, I feel like, of what a call would be, because that's the primary call.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so helpful just to get that broader sense. And then when we focus in on specific calling, Brian, I wanted to ask you, how do you view specific calling, and like, does your job always have to align with your calling? I know we have two vocational ministers right here, but you're outside of vocational ministry, but you're still a minister at heart. So can you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, and that's actually a big wrestle that I had beginning my career, because I felt called. I'm a physical therapist by trade, but I really felt that call before I had made a commitment to follow Jesus, and that Jesus had come into my life and had saved me, and so that was something that was birthed out of something all different than what I felt like God was calling me to. And so as I started that journey in 8th grade, and then my sophomore year is when God got a hold of me, and I gave my life to Him, and started walking through that, thinking, okay, well, this is, I have an opportunity to engage in people's lives, because really that's what called me to it initially. Was I just saw what the relationship of a physical therapist to their patient could be, and I wanted to be a part of that. But a part of me was like, well, I don't know if that was before. This is after. So I wrestled even all the way through graduating from PT school on whether or not that was, because I started going into clinicals and thinking, I thought maybe I could, because I was involved in a college ministry, and I was like, wow, this is just something I feel like God's drawing me to. And even to the point where right before I was about to graduate, I interviewed for a ministry position, for a full-time, even though I was about to graduate from physical therapy school. I was just a big wrestle. And even went on the mission field after physical therapy school, still wrestling with that idea. And when I came back and I started working, God just reminded me over and over that it wasn't me in 8th grade just deciding. Like that was something He placed on my heart that I thought was altogether different. And but that He over time has given me enormous opportunities to impact my patients for Him.
I think
in
that
unique
that's
ways,
so key to see that He uses us in all different ways, all different settings to be ministers of reconciliation, like you talked about. And so, could you chime in
I would
on
just like
that?
to add to that, knowing Brian so well, I think every calling can be a sacred calling.
Yes.
I think often when we talk about calling, especially within the church world and within Christian context, we're thinking about a certain kind of vocational calling that might be to church ministry or missions, and that is a calling, but that's not the only calling. And so the idea, I think God's heart for His people is that they would feel so alive in what they're doing vocationally, their family, where they live, that they would find the same sense of calling that any other church called minister might feel, that they think, okay, I'm called to this and I'm going to live as a missionary and live as a minister in whatever context I'm in, just like Brian's able to do that in PT world, you were able to do that in AT&T world, we're all able to do that in our neighborhoods and our cities. The idea is it's not just one kind of calling, it's calling, which is bigger than any one vocation.
Yeah, I think it's about living called and living sent wherever God has placed you. So what would be your practical tips to others about taking steps towards their calling? What does that look like? What are practical ways that we can do that?
I think for me, when I think about calling and think about how the Lord started asking me to feel like going into vocational ministry, I think there are some practical things of having conversations with people that are outside of you that could speak into, hey, I see this in you. Or if Brian was coming to me saying, I just felt this calling in the 8th grade to maybe do PT school, it's always wise to have people that just can affirm that and just encourage you and say, Andrew, I could definitely see you doing that. That makes a lot of sense. Or a person that says, I'm not real sure, maybe have you thought about this or that? And then there comes a practical step of, if I feel like this is what God wants, if this is an education thing, there is an aspect of faith at some point that says, I'm doing this at AT&T for the last 7.5 years, but I feel like God's calling me. But we have to make that step of faith. And sometimes it's hard. It's hard to take that thing that says, I know what I make over here. I know the income and how can I take care of my family. I don't know for sure what this is going to look like, but I feel like God's calling me to take that step.
That's so good. That's great. Y'all have anything to add?
I think and that was part of the wrestle that I had was me really needing to get that outside encouragement. And so I had a lot of people. Pastor Brad was a piece of that were speaking into what my next steps were going to be, and so I think that is really important for people to affirm or encourage away from the direction you're going, because sometimes it is a different way. But I think there's that, unfortunately, in calling there is that sacred secular divide that happens where it is you're a full-time vocational minister or you're the other. It's the same thing with you're a missionary or you're not a missionary. Really, we're all called to be missionaries, whether it's in in our neighborhoods, in the city, in the state, or abroad and overseas.
That's right.
But so there isn't that divide that I think we've unduly created, and I think makes it harder for people to feel called unless they're going to vocational ministry.
I love the conversation about godly counsel. The Bible's always encouraging us. God's always encouraging us to seek godly counsel, speak to other people about what you're feeling, but then trial and error. I mean, trial and error is such a big part of clarifying calling. So you think, well, maybe I feel called to this or called to that. Well, then start doing some of that and see where that goes, and allow the Lord to guide you in the midst of your activity. I think that's a key part.
Because that's huge.
Yeah, I think He will give you an aptitude. He won't call you. He won't call you to something that you're going to fail at. Because He wants you to be able to be seen in those circles, whatever those are, as being He wants you to be a light. And so I think He's going to give you an aptitude. He's going to give you a spiritual gift, even. That's going to speak to those areas that you might be called specifically.
Yeah. Well, we've had a conversation before about holy discontentment. Could y'all speak to that a little bit? And for those who are watching this, thinking about what is it in their hearts that really makes them discontent, and they know it might be from the Lord, like this restlessness. How can that help someone go towards their calling?
I'd say sometimes you don't even know that it's from the Lord. To start with, you might get frustrated about seeing homelessness, and you're just like, I don't even know why I'm so angry that there are people all around me that don't have a home. And you realize maybe that's a God-given discontentment. When I think about holy discontentment, I think about Moses, and he's watching all of his fellow Israelites
Yeah.
being abused and in slavery, and something in him just snapped. Like,
Yeah.
this is not the way it should be, and that drove him to action. And I think that's what holy discontentment looks like. For me, it's very simple. I cannot imagine people not living in eternity with Jesus. Like, that is just, that is not okay with me.
Yeah.
And so how does that play out in my vocation? Then I see my place as a mission field, and I'm just, it's a thing that burns. It's a thing that you just cannot get away from.
Yeah.
It moves you to action.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think there's some conversation about discontentment because most discontentment can be unholy.
Yes.
I'm discontent, I'm frustrated in this relationship, frustrated with my boss at work, frustrated with my house, my situation, whatever it is, a lot of unholy discontent. But if there's something that seems like it's coming from the heart of God,
Yeah.
and it's discontentment, then you start asking more questions around it and saying, well, why do I feel frustrated that even vocationally, think of a teacher that's frustrated that kids aren't learning right, or seeing the families that the homes are coming from and feeling like they don't have a background. Say, somebody's got to do something about that.
Right.
And the moment I begin to say someone should probably do something about that might be a sign that I'm the someone that should do something about that.
So
and so
good.
I see that in the church, whether there's somebody saying, somebody should do something about anything in our ministries. I see that on the world, and I think if it's something that seems like it would be in the heart of God and I'm discontent, you've got to just start paying a lot of attention to it. Start thinking about it, praying about it, and seeing maybe I'm part of the solution
Yeah.
to whatever's wrong in the world around me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank y'all so much. Do y'all have any final thoughts to help those who are watching figure out how they might be able to discern the call of God on their life? Final thoughts.
I would just say, sometimes we have signs, we have things that are around us that we kind of walk by every day and we forget, but we have a sign walking outside the door of the church. Maybe you've seen it before. It says, you are now entering your mission field.
Yeah.
And I think to remember that when I go to PT today, when I go to AT&T, when I go to teach at school, God has given me a platform and a calling at that specific place, at that specific time, to do something for His name,
Yes.
for His renown. And I think sometimes I walk past that sign and forget, but this is a holy calling. When I go to my cul-de-sac, I've got people around me that need to know who Jesus is, and that is a piece of my calling.
Yeah, so good. It's encouraging to me because when I go home with my girls, that's my calling. It's not
Yes.
minimized, and I think that that's something that I need to be affirmed in sometimes. So that's really helpful.
Yes.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think it's just to remind people that everyone is called.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, I think that's the biggest misunderstanding of that word.
Yeah.
Is that it is vocational ministry, and that's those who are called, and everyone else is everyone else.
Yes.
But just to remind everybody, and for them to even being is all of us talked about in different ways, seeking godly counsel, being in prayer, just asking
Yes.
God to share with you what that is, and like people really engaging in that, because that's going to be the first step for people making a tremendous impact
Yes.
in the place where they're already called. Because I think
Yes.
that already is so true with what you said.
Yes.
Like, I think so many times people are looking for, okay, what's the next thing that God has? But God is a sovereign God. We are around the people where we are. We are in the
Yes.
job we are in. We are
Yeah.
we're in the neighborhood we're in. We're in all of the places that we are, because God has called us specifically to reach out to those people that He's surrounded us by.
Yeah.
And if
That's right.
if we look at the horizon for what's next, or what this call that we
Yeah.
don't quite understand is, or that it's for someone else, we miss the opportunity that
So
God's
good.
called us to right that moment.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Thank you, Brian. That's great.
I think I would just say that often we get paralyzed by this big idea of calling, and so we might get trapped in trying to find the big thing and like,
Yeah.
well, when that appears, then I'll do something. And I think
Right.
it's more likely that as you just take action every day, you're more likely to live your calling if you live your calling today. What am I called to do today, this week? My family, my loved ones, for the gospel. If I will live my calling today, whatever seems like the thing that the Lord's leading you to, you're never going to have a problem fulfilling your
Yeah.
calling with life.
So
And I
good.
think it helps you to get out of the future and get into today. And that getting in today makes you more likely to live it out in the
Awesome.
future.
Yeah, so good. Thank you all so
Yeah.
much for joining me. I
Sure.
really
Glad
appreciate
Glad
it.
to.